Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this first afternoon session, the session on finding the threat and ways to respond. Now, every year when we are putting together the program for Cycon and selecting the papers to publish in our book, there are a number of papers that are quite difficult to put into a clearly defined theme or topic. And so these are basically the orphans or the familyless articles we're struggling to find a good place for. And this is this session. But actually, when you look closer at it, this is very much an all-encompassing session, because when you think what is important to do as nations in response to the threat in cyberspace, the first thing you have to do is define the threat. And that's where Steve comes in, who has done a research on the likelihood of terrorist organizations using cyberspace for launching attacks. So he will talk about the threat. When you've defined the threat, you will have to inform your nation, your population about this threat, and you gotta find a way to do this properly. And that's where Sean comes in, because he's been doing research into the cyber doom effect of how you can oversell the threat and thereby diminish the effectiveness of your policies by misinforming your population. So that's where you come in about your response. And if you've done that, you've got to figure out as a nation, well, what strategies and policies do we need to develop to effectively counter the threat? And that's where Lior comes in, who will be speaking about the Israeli approach to cybersecurity, about the Israeli strategy, and about the ways the policy is implementing the strategy. So all in all, we have a very holistic session here, and afterwards you'll be informed about all aspects of cybersecurity. So this is basically the whole Cycon event in one condensed 1.5 hours. So having raised the bar for you, I don't want to increase the pressure on you, but please, inform us all about it. Steve, floor is yours. Steve is a lead investigator and senior researcher in the Unconventional Weapons and Technology Division of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. And the acronym is START. So please, start.
Thank you, Mathis. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Sen. As Mathis said, I'm from the University of Maryland. And I have a unconcerted effort to advertise my center at the end of the presentation. And so we'll talk about what we actually do a little bit at the end of my presentation. So a little bit of expectation management. It says determining the extremist organization's likelihood of conducting cyber attacks. What I would like to tell you is that this particular research is at its infancy, and this paper is about the first stage of the research that we have been conducting. And we are currently in the phase 2 of the research, and we'll talk about a little bit of that at the end of the presentation. So the first 4 bullets that you see on that slide are some of the things that you will see if you read any of the technical magazines or technical journals every day. So that is actually where we started our work, because we were looking at all these things, and I was actually hoping that Sean was going to go first so that I can dovetail off of his thing and say, hey, look, there's this hype thing going on. But unfortunately, that was not the case. I'll just make the case for him. And so we said, hey, look, there's all these cyber activities going on, and apparently we talk about things like Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber Armageddon. In fact, we talked about a little bit of that in the criminalization of cyber attacks panel yesterday. But I'm a terrorism researcher, and I had a problem. On a completely unrelated topic or unrelated research, what was completed about a year ago, we were tasked with tracking active terrorist organizations throughout Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Africa. And between 2008 and 2012, we have identified 143 terrorist organizations that had at least conducted one attack in those regions. Now here's my conundrum. If you have 143 organizations conducting terrorist attacks in a 5-year span, why is ISIS the only one that's on the news about cyber attacks? And if the media is correct, and if our open source reporting is correct, then we should see some more organizations trying to do this. And we don't quite see that many. So that was one of our questions. So that's the question. Why aren't violent extremist organizations, and we included the term violent extremist organization, not necessarily just terrorists, to broaden our research scope. And we said, why aren't they using cyber attacks as much as they possibly could be doing? And we weren't as such interested in, well, are they doing things like SCADA attacks or infrastructure attacks or destructive attacks? We were actually interested in everything from things like DDoS, website defacing, all the way up to something that's kinetically involved. And we see quite a small amount of that. We actually don't see a lot at all. So, of course, we dove into the literature and we said, well, there are certain reasons that you want to go online, right? Cyber has been dubbed as somewhat of a David versus Goliath story. If you're the David, cyber is a good way to beat the Goliath. Well, okay. And also, a lot of the terrorism research has shown that terrorist organizations or extremist organizations have gone online to evade the law enforcement efforts, which is true. A lot of the recruitment happens online now, actually almost all of it. A lot of the command and control happens online. So, those are all the good reasons why they need to actually use the cyber mechanism to conduct their business every day. But it's also the same medium they can use to attack, but they have not done so, so we were wondering why that was. And of course, the assessment, from the literature anyway, from the assessment that the primary reason that people should go online are things like non-attribution and ease of purchasing the cyber weapons, or things like, well, we have these kits now, so you don't necessarily have to be the coder, you just go buy the kits. Well, okay. So those were the assessments, but they were not jiving with what we were seeing, at least anecdotally, from our research center. So here are some of the reasons that the literature says this is why they don't go online. The first three are pretty simple, right? Well, terrorists want to incite fear. How do you do that online? Or achieving your political end goals, how do you do that online? And then the best one, I think, actually for me, is the visualization of destruction, right? Something needs to blow up. Terrorists love things blowing up. Well, it's not very sexy, if you will, in the American terms, to have some guy sitting on a computer screen. That's not a good recruitment video. So, but relatively speaking, you can do things to incite fear. You don't necessarily have to destroy anything to incite fear. So one of the things that I was talking to Mathis about as we were going back and forth on editing our paper, and thank you very much for your great comments, by the way, was that, look, imagine, and ISIL has already done some of this. Imagine a case where they hack into the NATO database and they steal personnel information from NATO. And oh, by the way, and one of my colleagues is such a case, is that, she loves Facebook. And you can basically track her entire movement throughout the day using Facebook. So if I have the personnel information from NATO, I have her Facebook, it does not take a genius to figure out what she does, who her families are, sorry, Rob, and all the other pertinent detail for you to actually do something to her. Now, they don't actually necessarily do anything to her. All they have to do is release this information and say, hey, look, we have your information, and we want to go kill you. So for us in NATO, this may not be a big deal, right? We're all in this business. Well, if this gets released to, for example, my country's Fox News, that will be a bad day. The Sean will probably end up talking about that kind of effect. So it is relatively easy to do if you can imagine these kind of scenarios. It's nothing that nears cyber Armageddon or cyber Pearl Harbor, but it's something that they can do. It's within their feasibility. Now, there are disruption versus destruction questions in the literature about, well, you know, cyber attacks are usually for disruption rather than destruction. Well, okay, well, terrorists can do either one, they can still achieve their objective. So that's not necessarily really the reason why they shouldn't do it. The other thing really is the difficulty of attribution, right? So one of the advantages of using internet is that you cannot get attributed to it. Well, except you're a terrorist, which means you want to claim that you did it. So this is in direct conflict with their actual interest, and maybe that's why they don't do it. That may be the case. And then we also, of course, have the cost versus the cost issue. Material that's needed to do all this, personnel, except we kind of have to change our conceptualization in this case when we talk about cost factors, because we were sitting there thinking about things like, well, you know, if this was a state actor doing all this, in the case of the United States, most of these, and most of the countries, most of these are clandestine operations. We don't actually know, as a public, we don't know who or what capabilities we actually have and what the government is planning on doing next. And we spend millions of dollars training our force to do cyber attacks, cyber defense, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the case of terrorists or extremist organizations, the calculus has to change because, you know, I don't have to have my own NSA secure program to do this if I'm an extremist organization. I can just outsource all that. But that is still a cost because that is an operational security issue for the terrorist organization. How can you trust your third party to actually do what you want them to do and be secure about it? So that could be one of those things. And then, of course, the sustainability issue. Terrorists are not, or extremist organizations are not necessarily looking for things like APT-type events, right? They don't want to do persistent surveillance on a target. They want something, and if they're going to do that, they only do it for a medium-term duration so that they can get a quick turnaround and something that's very explosive and very disruptive in the public. So it's not, APT is something not to their interest. So we had all these literature that says, yes, this is why you want to go online. No, this is why you don't want to go online. But here was still the question was, no, there was no systematic research that was done that says, why do they or why don't they do it? Is it the capability issue? Is it that it's just not them? They just don't want to do it? But we still don't know. So that drove our thing. So since there was no other systematic research that we could base this upon, so we decided on a three-phase approach. The phase one was we have in START, that's the acronym for our center, because if I actually spelled out the thing, it's 2 lines long. So at START, we have accumulated a large amount of database on terrorist activities, terrorist organizations, and we have a profile for them. So we decided we can use some of those profiles, some of those variables that we used in those profiles to see if we can get a start on building the internet side or the cyber side of these profiles. As phase 2 then will be to collecting the information and coding them. And then the phase 3 obviously is to actually do the empirical regression or whatever methodology that we will use to analyze the results. And so this paper actually is some of the interesting results that we found from the phase 1 of this entire research. And primarily what we did was we did a survey research, and from the survey we actually did contact some of the participants to get some more detailed thoughts, why they think that was the case, and here are some of our impressions. So first and foremost, these are all the variables that we asked them from our profiles. There are in 4 different categories, and I apologize for the small prints. And I think, some will work. So we have the organizational factors, resource factors, sophistication. This is where you ask things like, is the organization technically sophisticated? Have they shown tactical sophistication, et cetera, et cetera? And then obviously you have prior activities factors. So these do not necessarily ask. We added prior history of cyber attack. This was something that we added. Currently, we in the profiles have things like, does the organization have a history of violent extremism or a violent attack? Well, if you're in an extremism database or violent extremist database, the answer is yes, but we wanted to know what the experts thought, if that actually attributed to them being cyber active or not. And we ended up administering to our survey to about 300 people. This is not necessarily a very random sample, because what we ended up doing was it was a ballooning sample. So, me and our START consortium know so many people, and then they said, oh, hey, these guys are doing this research, this is great, why don't you guys do it too? And we ended up about 300 people. About 18.67% return rate, that's actually in a survey research. That is an outstanding return rate, believe it or not. And that actually gets us about 56 people. Not a terribly large sample, so it's not an empirical case yet. It's somewhat anecdotal, but we can still do this. So there are three groups. You have obviously all participants, 56, and then we were lucky enough to have about 50%. I think it was somewhere breaking down into 51%, 48%, 51%, or 52% technical participants, and 48% or so that was non-technical. Non-technical meaning we're policy folks like me. I'm a political scientist by training. I'm actually an international relations person, so that turned to this way. My advisor still calls me that I turned to the dark side. So non-technical persons are folks like me, and then technical folks that are one of our co-authors who's actually a coder and things like that. And then obviously we got them divided up into public sector, which is primarily government, private sector, who works in the private companies, and then the academia. So, very small slide. This is not intended for you to read, but the bottom line is, interestingly enough, there were some consistencies between just the straight survey results, and we did a quantitative result run of the survey, and it seems everybody thinks the key is the human resource, whether you have it within the organization or you have the ability to go out and reach out to somebody and say, hey, can you do this for me? Which seemed to make sense to me. It's like, okay, that seems to make sense. What was interesting to us actually was that in the survey, one of the things that we also asked the participants was, are there variables that you would think that we did not ask you that you want to add? And the answer was actually we didn't get any of that. And then there were also some questions that we asked, are there variables that you think it's worthless? We should not ask this question. And actually, to my very pleasant surprise, we did not have to throw out any variables or add any variables, actually. But some of the interesting findings were where the discrepancies were between the different groups as we broke down the analysis. So the technical group seems to think that the consensus was that there were consensus between the groups about activity factors. So everybody seems to think that if you have shown the propensity to conduct violent extremist activities, that could drive you to do things. Because at the end of the day, maybe that is something that is the most important thing for you to achieve your end goal. So it's like what we talked about yesterday in the criminalization panel. It is about, at the end of the day, what is most effective to achieve your goal. So maybe that was it. And we thought, well, that was pretty neat. What's not on there actually was that we found something that was very interesting. So in the terrorism research area, ideology usually shows up as one of the highest things to determine motivation and intent of organizations. Oddly enough, the technical folks in our case said ideology was very important. The non-technical side actually said, ideology? Who cares about ideology? Which is in complete contradiction with our terrorism research that's been going on, which I thought was very interesting. I will still have to investigate why that actually happened, but that's another research question. And then the findings for when you broke out different subgroups. And the ones in the red lines are what each group thought was important. And so what's really interesting to me is the difference between private sector and everybody else. So the private sector, the companies, the folks that were working in the companies thought the most important thing really is the networking ability of the organization, which actually is congruent with a lot of the terrorism research. So if you know someone that's doing the cyber attack, and if you know how to get there, if you have a network available to you, you can use that network to serve your own purposes. That's what the private sector was thinking about, while the private and academic, or public and the academic sector were thinking about things like leadership organization structures and things like, what was the, innovation, or no, wait. Leadership structures and organizational composition, organizational size. So those were the things that we were talking about in public and academia. Now, so what was shown really is maybe something that we kind of knew about, that we kind of heard in our background about, oh, you know, I can't talk to those coders because we just talk past each other. Well, this actually kind of shows some of that going on in between these subgroups, but there were some congruencies as well that was found that we were like, oh, that's kind of nice, that we actually have some common ground. Also, what we did find is that internally between the groups, within the group, with what we call the within group congruency is very high. So everybody in the academia thinks the same way. Everybody in the private sector thinks pretty much the same way. Everybody in the government pretty much thinks the same way, regardless if you're technical or non-technical. It's probably because what we're doing every day and what we're faced with every day is different. But since there are some congruencies, there are some things that we can start off our conversations with. And that is one of the important things that we found is that, yeah, all groups exhibit internal congruencies, and you can actually have a conversation about the differences and why you have differences. And so based off of this data, what we ended up doing was that we incorporated all the comments. We incorporated some of the cyber activities variables that we asked our panel into what the START already has in existence, called the Big, Bad, and Dangerous data set, or BAD. Yes, again, political science cannot do anything without acronyms, just like the military. So I did a great transition from the US Army. Acronym to acronym is great. And then, so that particular data set that we used have 142 insurgency/violent extremist organizations on it between 1998 and 2012. Over the last 6 months or so between the time this paper was submitted and now, we collected and coded all those data. And this summer, we'll collect 2013 and 2015 data for the data set. And what was very surprising, there was not a lot of variances in dependent variable, meaning there was not a lot of attacks like as we thought. But what was actually surprising was that the early trends seemed to point to perhaps we need to think about not just the threat, but also the target. So for example, if you're a terrorist organization in Rwanda, cyber attack's not going to get you anywhere. What are you going to attack? Okay, so you attack the Rwandan government, but that's not necessarily going to do anything. But if you're attacking Israel, cyber attack may be the thing to do. So perhaps, so we were focused on this from the threat perspective, but the early trends, and this is very anecdotal because we have not done the completed collection and analysis yet, but the early trends seem to say, well, you know, threat is important, but target is also important. What are you going after? And in a very short period of time, and this is a unconcealed advertisement of the center. So we are actually a DHS Center of Excellence, just like CCCOE. CCD COE. It's like, so we are similar to you in that sense. We are based at the University of Maryland, and we have about 75 research and staff at our headquarters. Plus, it's a consortium, so we have about relations with about 50 academic and institutions across the world and in the United States. And what's listed there are primarily what we do, and cyber is something that we are getting into, but we only do it from, and we are a social science center, so you know, my partner is a social psychologist and et cetera, so we actually do cyber from the social aspects. We kind of try to figure out why people do what they do, because there is a person behind that screen at the end of the day. So thank you very much. And
Thank you, Steve. I think we're going to do the questions and answer round at the end, so